I have to admit, I don't know what the Legend app is, and I don't know that company, but they have an open source team that has distributed a really good state manager for a tiny $3K. You get a fully reactive state manager where you can observe values, trigger on values. It's completely reactive. It does fine-grained updating, and you can use it either as local state, pass it around with the context, or use it to replace your global state manager. It's awesome. Let me show you all three of those scenarios. Let's get right into it. All right, the example application I have for you is a very rudimentary Next.js application. It has 3 routes in it, and you can get the code in GitHub. There's a link in the description right down below. Basically, there's 3 sections. There's a section on local state, then one around passing state around as context, and then another on global state. So let's take a look at the local state, and we'll actually implement on that. So here we have a very simple local state example. You've got some state, a first name and a last name, and then you've got a computed value right down below that just joins those 2 names together. Let's go back to a simpler starting point so you can see how to build this out using the state manager. All right, here's our starting point. We have a component called local. It has the header at the top that has the link to the home page and then the title of this page. Then it has 2 div sections, one for the first name, one for the last name. Each one of those has a label and then an input. And then finally, down the bottom, we're going to have a section where we put the first name and the last name. So what we need to do now is bring in Legend App State. So we're going to bring in use observable from Legend App State and the React bindings within that. This is a hook, so use observable, and it wraps their core observable primitive. So you can either make observables directly, or you can use them with this hook, which makes it just a lot easier. So using that use observable, we then define that we have an observable object with a first and last name key. We could have used anything. We could have used an array, a number, a string, whatever we want in there. In this case, we're going to use an object. We're going to map that to person. Let me show you how to connect that then to our inputs. To get the value, you do person.first.get and person.last.get. This is a little different than we might have seen in other state managers where we might do person.get and then do .last or .first from that. It would return an object and then we would get the key off that. In this case, we're going directly to the key itself. So person.first.get. Pretty cool. To set a value, we just do .set. So in this case, person.first.set and person.last.set. Now this is where I think this model for state management actually way improves over something like useState, even for local state management. Reason being that what we're doing is essentially mutating the object in place, which is a lot more efficient than something like useState, where we have to, if we had a person object, we'd have to create a new object with a shallow copy and then overwrite the key that we wanted to replace in order to signal to React that we had a state change. In this case, we just do .set, we mutate that value in place, and this Legend App State Manager picks that up. And that's why I think the Legend App State Manager performs so well in benchmarks. It actually is top of the class in state managers in terms of performance on benchmarks. Really cool. All right, the last thing we need to do in this example is show those values. Get right in place there. Now let's try it out. All right, now this isn't working. I'm typing and nothing's happening. The reason is that this component isn't marked as an observer. So we need to bring in observer. This is a higher order function that we can use to wrap our function and say that this component is observing Legend App state values. Now at this point, everything works just fine. All right, but this is pretty simple. What happens if we want to go and take this state and then prop drill it down to some of our components? How does that work? So let's go and take out the last name and first name and take those and turn them into their own components. So we'll take out first name first. So we need to get person to this component now, so we're going to use a prop for that. But we're in TypeScript, so how do we type that? So we're going to type person, and we're going to say that it's an observable object. And then we give it the definition of the object. And that's it. Now we can use it down here and give it our person. Now let's do the same thing for last name. And then use that. All right, we'll hit save and try it again. All right, this still works. That's really good. Now let's go take that full name and make it its own component. And then we'll use that. So this is no longer working. And what I think is happening here is that we are no longer anywhere in local calling .get. So we were before because this div is calling .get. So the component is no longer re-rendering. So what we need to do is make each one of the components that actually observes the state an observer. In this case, we don't actually need local to be an observer anymore since it actually doesn't observe the state. So let's get rid of that and then make full name, first name, and last name observers. And now it works just fine. And in fact, if we go over to the inspector and then into the components section and we turn on highlight updates when components re-render, we can see that we're getting really good isolation here. So if I change first name, then only first name is getting updated and the full name is getting updated. Same thing with last name. If I change the last name, it only changes the last name. So it's very clearly only looking at what we are subscribed to in that component. So that's great. But what happens if we actually don't want this full name to re-render at all? Well, we can use the fine-grained reactivity that's baked into this legend app state. Let's go try this out. So let's remove the observer here and see what happens. So nothing happens, this doesn't get updated. But what we can do is we can bring in a new function called enable legend state react. And then we'll call that, and what this does is tell legend state that we want to go into that fine-grained reactivity mode. So the last thing we need to do is remove the .gets here, hit save, and now we can update, but notice we are updating the full name, but we're actually not doing any React updating. How cool is that? All right, so now that we know how to use this legend state at a local level, how can we use context to avoid moving around the state as props? Let's go take a look at our context example. And here we see something similar to what we had before, but notice that we have essentially two forms, and each one of them has isolated first name, last name, and that full name as the computed value. So let's go take a look at how this is done. So in our context example, we start with the context and computed component. It just creates two form containers. So let's go take a look at form container. Form container is what we have at the top level. It's got two observables, one for first name and last name, and then it uses the use computed hook, which is just a React wrapper around their computed primitive to create a new computed value. Very nice. And then it provides all of that first and the last name and full name down to any component that wants it anywhere in the tree below that using the provider. The provider looks like this. So we use React's built-in create context to create a person provider context. That person provider has either an object that has first, last name, and the full name that are typed using observables, or it has null. And then we have use person, which gets the value from that context and uses bang to say that it always exists so you don't get kind of nasty issues around typing. So, all right, let's go take a look at how we actually use this. So within that person provider, we have an outer container. And then within that outer container, we have an inner container. And within that inner container, we have the first, last, and name. Now, the reason we have that kind of nesting is just to show that you can have a hierarchy where you're getting data from one point up to the root all the way down to one of the subcomponents really easily. So now in terms of the first component, last component, and name component, we're just using use person instead of getting those values by props. Everything else is the same as the similar components over in the local example. And here's the really nice thing. This works really well in Next.js context when you don't want to use anything as global. It also works really well at either the top level of the app if you're going to want to do a create React app or a Vite app, or you want to provide everything down anywhere in the hierarchy you want it. Or you can do it like in this example where you have these self-contained forms and you can instantiate multiples of them and their state is completely isolated from each other using this context. All right, the last one I wanted to show you is over in global. Here we have that similar state isolation that we had before. One of the new additions here is that we are looking to see if the complete size of the string of the computed value is odd or even, and then we're changing the color based on that. So that's showing you how to do some styling. Let's go take a look at the code. So in this global state example, instead of using use observable and use computed, we're just using observable and computed directly right from the Legend app core state manager. So this is their basic reactivity tools that they are wrapping in hooks for us on the React side. Here we're just using them directly. So we're creating a person object that's observable like we had in the local example. We're creating a full computed value that has the full name, and then we're creating a derived value called isOdd that looks at the full name, so where it's a computed on top of a computed, and that tells us whether we have an odd or even number of characters in the string. In the root component itself, we don't do anything at all. We don't create any kind of context or anything like that. We're just going to let the global handle everything. So first and last, just get that global state directly. They do need to be marked as observers though, just like they were before, because they need to get re-rendered whenever there's a change to that observable state. And then name is pretty cool. We're bringing this legend component. Now this legend component has a bunch of dot components in it, one for each of the basic HTML flavors. So it's got legend.div. And those legend components give you dollar values like class name dollar. And that can take a function where when an observable changes in there, then you can compute a new value based on that observable. It's a really nice way to add some reactivity without having to mark the whole component as an observer. But we're still doing that fine-grained reactivity by using the computed value of full by just doing full as opposed to full.get, and that's enabled by that enable legend state react function that we call. Just lots of great stuff in this Legend app state manager. I hope this quick look at it gets you excited about it. There really aren't a lot of people using it right now. I think this is because it's a new library out there. But I think it's really great. It's really comprehensive. It's got a good MobX kind of atomic feel. It strikes a nice balance in there. You can use it in a whole bunch of different contexts. As I said, you can use it locally. You can use it as context. You can use it globally. And it's got that fine-grained reactivity that folks are looking for in signals like preact-signals. And it's done pretty elegantly. So I'm really enjoying this one. Anyway, in the meantime, of course, if you have any questions or comments, be sure to put that in the comment section right down below. If you like the video, hit that like button. If you really like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on that bell, and you'll be notified the next time a new one of these blue-collar videos comes out.